Matthew 18, from verse 21. Then Peter came up and said to Jesus, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold, with his wife and children, and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, Pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused, and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt, because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. We are beggars all, that's the truth. If you want to meet a theologian who says precisely what he's thinking at any one time, then I might simply refer you to Martin Luther, the person who kick-started the Reformation in many ways. Here was a man who took on the papacy. Here was a man who translated the Bible into German whilst he was on the run. Here is a man who had 55 volumes of works. And if you read through them, and particularly the transcriptions of the comments that he made to his students whilst eating with them, then you see a man who had a great sense of humour, and a man who said things which these days you wouldn't get away with it. But he was a man also who realised the great grace that God has shown us, because he knew that he was not perfect. He had an understanding that he was flawed. He knew that he'd done things that were wrong. He knew that he couldn't reach perfection, that he fell far short. But he also knew the grace of God, which is why, on his deathbed, he said, We are beggars all, that's the truth. And in fact, you could say that those words summed up the entire Reformation project, knowing our own sinfulness and knowing God's gracefulness. That is the great thing. Now, at this point, many people might object, because in the modern age, we're told the best way to get mental health is to be positive about yourself, to have that positive mental attitude, to be told, like the L'Oreal adverts, you're worth it, to have our egos polished and our self-esteem built up. But that isn't the way of the Reformation. In fact, that isn't really the way of Christianity at all. But let me explain to you why Christianity has the better path. And to do that, let me introduce you to another great figure, that of John Newton. Now, John Newton was a man who, like his father, was a sailor. In fact, at age 11, he was taken to sea. And in the end, he managed to find himself a job in a merchant's office, but he was dismissed because, I quote, of his unsettled behaviour and impatience of restraint. His unsettled behaviour and impatience of restraint. He was then press-ganged into the Navy. But there, even with all of the debauchery often associated with the navy at that age, even there he stood out. He wrote of himself that he sinned with a high hand. He also said of himself, I made it my study to tempt and seduce others. He deserted the navy and therefore earned a flogging. And in the end, he became the captain of a slave ship. But during a storm, he was converted to Christianity. This was a great shift, obviously, in his thinking. This was a great shift in the way that he looked at himself, the way that he looked at other people, the way that he looked at the slaves upon his ship. And he ended up not only as an Anglican clergyman, but also one of the leading campaigners for the abolition of slavery, which of course eventually was achieved in this country. But looking back on his life, he wrote this. Let me read it to you. If the question is concerning the patience of God, the wonderful interposition of his providence in favour of an unworthy sinner, the power of his grace in softening the hardest heart, and the riches of his mercy in pardoning the most enormous and aggravated transgressions, in these respects I know no case more extraordinary than my own. And as he pens that famous hymn, Amazing Grace, he knew that he was the wretch who was slaved. Now, back to that thought that you're holding, that thought that we shouldn't be down with ourselves, that we shouldn't think of ourselves as terrible sinners, that we should be more positive instead, that all this talk of wretches and beggars is simply unhealthy. Well, the passage from Matthew's Gospel that I read at the beginning of all of this challenges that thinking. Peter is talking about forgiveness. Peter is wondering how often he should forgive somebody. It's there in the passage. And Jesus responds with a parable about letting people off debts. The meaning is clear. We have been forgiven much by God. Therefore, we should forgive other people. The forgiveness we've received, we should also extend to other people. But here's the thing. If we think that God hasn't been gracious to us, that if God hasn't forgiven us much, because frankly, there isn't much to be forgiven, well, then we miss out on this extraordinary grace which Luther experienced, that Newton experienced. Think of it in this way. Somebody gives you a present and you open it thinking, well, I deserve this. I've earned this. Yes, this is a lovely present. This is precisely what I should have. Well, you're not really grateful, are you? Because you think you've just got your just deserts. You earned what you've been given. But if instead you're given a present out of the blue, and that it's much greater than you think you deserve, well, you're overwhelmed with gratitude and with thankfulness. This is the point. When we realise that we haven't earned God's forgiveness, when we understand that God is more gracious than ever we can think, that he gives us more than we can desire or deserve. Well, if we grasp that truth, we can revel in the outstanding grace of God towards us. And then with the forgiveness that we have received, well, we can extend that to others.